Let's dive right into this explainer on evidence and witnesses. Now, if you're familiar with the parallel systems of state and jural assemblies, you know that their authority relies entirely on a solid, factual foundation. So rather than just rehashing the basic mechanics of assembly courts, we're going to objectively examine the source materials to see exactly how evidence functions as the absolute lifeblood of this alternative justice system. We're going to break down what actually constitutes true evidence, how witnesses establish the record, and why the sources argue that strict evidentiary standards are literally the most important thing when trying to reconstruct a lawful government.
To really wrap our heads around assembly jurisdiction, we have to start with a deceptively simple question. What is evidence? In this framework, evidence is defined as the verified information, facts, and documentation used to actually resolve disputes and administer true justice. The texts draw a really sharp contrast here. They argue that modern administrative tribunals operate largely on legal presumptions, whereas a true common law framework demands concrete, factual weight. It requires tangible proof of actual harm rather than just presumed commercial compliance.
And because of that distinction, there's a massive difference in the types of evidence that are actually recognized. On one side, you have testimonial evidence. This comes directly from the living man or woman. It's firsthand accounts of real events and real harm. On the flip side, the sources claim that modern equity and admiralty jurisdictions rely almost entirely on documentary or paper evidence, which is usually tied to a legal fiction or an artificial corporate entity. Understanding this hierarchy between living testimony and state-generated documentation is absolutely crucial in common law proceedings.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The texts explain that the state relies heavily on extensive public records, trusts, and bonds to maintain its jurisdiction. The argument is that every court case is essentially treated as a managed security, funded by an individual's estate and propped up by administrative paperwork. And because the state uses this documentary evidence to establish its authority, meticulous counter-record keeping becomes a vital everyday practice for anyone trying to operate outside of that commercial system.
So what does this all mean for due process? Well, according to the sources, this dynamic fundamentally alters it. They claim that in a commercial setting, true due process is totally bypassed because judges are basically acting as administrative magistrates. They're ruling on statutory presumptions and enforcing contracts. So instead of having a jury weigh actual, factual evidence of harm against a living victim, the court is just processing breaches of commercial trust based purely on administrative filings.
Part 1. Historical Justifications and Foundational Law.
The authors use a very specific historical timeline to trace the evolution or maybe the devolution of evidentiary standards. It starts with the 1215 Magna Carta, which they view as establishing the people's inherent right to independently weigh evidence. Then we jump to the 1776 Declaration of Independence, which functioned essentially as a documented presentation of evidence against the Crown. But then the timeline points to the 1863 Lieber Code. The sources argue this was the turning point that shifted evidentiary rules away from civilian common law facts, replacing them with martial presumptions and military jurisdiction.
To counter this, the texts argue that jurisdictional claims require physical evidence. A great example they point to is the United States civil flag of peacetime, the one with the vertical stripes. Displaying a symbol like this serves as physical, documented evidence of a claimant's peaceful non-combatant status. It's a tangible way of asserting that you are operating squarely within a civilian jurisdiction, completely free from the evidentiary rules of martial or admiralty courts.
Part 2. The Power of the Grand Jury and Ultimate Law Enforcement.
When it comes to gathering evidence, the grand jury is viewed as the undisputed heavyweight. The texts strongly assert that it functions as a completely independent investigative body, one that is entirely unaccountable to standard government branches. The grand jury uses tools like presentments and investigations to compile verified documentary and testimonial evidence, and they do this long before a trial jury ever even sees a case.
Think about the capabilities outlined here. A key feature is their expansive subpoena power, which they use to compel the production of both physical and documentary evidence. By independently evaluating the true, factual weight of the evidence they gather, the sources claim the grand jury has the ultimate authority to nullify state statutes, specifically those they determine lack of verified injured party or violate common law evidentiary standards.
Part 3. Challenging Jurisdiction and Statutory Defense.
But how do these texts suggest you actually interact with conventional courts right now? They provide a very specific procedural script framed entirely around evidentiary demands. It starts with filing a notice of special appearance, then challenging the underlying trust, which eventually leads to demanding a verified complaint. At its core, this is a demand for concrete, documentary, and testimonial evidence from a living, injured party. The whole goal is to expose the lack of actual evidence in what they view as purely statutory charges.
It all really boils down to this test of documentary evidence. Asking questions that demand the production of a contract serves a highly specific legal purpose. It requires physical proof of consent. The argument is that if an administrative court cannot produce an actual physical contract bearing a wet ink signature, then they simply lack the necessary evidentiary foundation to establish any lawful jurisdiction over you.
Part 4. The Living Court Framework and Parallel Justice.
For those building a parallel justice system, the Living Court Framework assigns very specific evidentiary duties to its officers. For example, the bondsman is directly tasked with securing the physical evidence and the courtroom itself. Meanwhile, the justice plays a fascinating role. They do not rule on the facts at all. Instead, they act strictly as a gatekeeper, ensuring that rigid rules of evidence admissibility are followed to the letter before anything is ever presented to the trial jury.
If we look at how an assembly court mock trial operates, you'll see the entire focus shifts to credibility, reliability, and corroboration. When the accused and the witnesses testify, the jury's job is to actively evaluate their firsthand reliability. On top of that, multiple witnesses are required just to provide corroboration. This is the vital step that takes an individual claim and transforms it into a proven fact, ensuring the testimonial evidence meets the really high threshold required for true common law due process.
Reconstructing a lawful government from the bottom up is no small task, and it relies heavily on extremely diligent record-keeping. The sources stress the meticulous recording of sworn affidavits at the county level. By placing first-hand, verified claims into the public record under the penalty of perjury, assemblies are essentially cementing their testimonial evidence into permanent, undisputed, public documentary evidence.
This quote really captures the driving philosophy behind all of this, the idea that man doesn't create law, he discovers it. It ties directly back to the investigation of facts. The belief is that natural law dictates true justice, must be based on unearthing undeniable truths. Evidence is simply the primary tool used in that discovery process, giving juries exactly what they need to verify where harm occurred and figure out the proper legal remedy.
So what are we ultimately taking away from this? In any lawful assembly, documentary, physical, and testimonial evidence are the essential engines that drive due process. By putting the priority on first-hand witness credibility, meticulous record-keeping, and absolutely stringent corroboration, these alternative systems are attempting to guarantee that rulings are grounded in absolute fact, rather than administrative presumption. Evidence and witness testimony provide the factual foundation upon which investigations, jury decisions, and public justice depend.